Welcome back, everyone. I'm Megan Merkovich, current Vice President of NAWA's Community Connection Committee. Our final session today is brought to you by the chefs at Travelers. The Travelers Predictive Modeling Cooking Show is a window into the kitchen of master chefs as they work. Except the chefs are whipping up something different, a predictive model. Have your devices ready because this is an interactive session. And please turn on your videos if possible, because our chefs love an audience. And now I'll turn it over to the chefs.
Presenting live for the 2023 NAWA annual meeting, this is the Travelers Predictive Modeling Cooking Show. It's the modeling sensation that's sweeping the nation. You may have been hoping for freshly baked bread, but nope. Today we're cooking up tasty GLMs. Remember, if you can't stand the heat, get out of prediction. And now, here is your host, the Travelers' own, Rochelle Pereira!
Morning, good afternoon, welcome. Thank you for joining today's workshop. My name is Rochelle Pereira, and I work at Travelers Insurance in St. Paul, Minnesota, as an actuary and predictive modeler in our bond and specialty insurance division. We are so excited to be partnering with the Network of Actuarial Women and Allies for this special edition of the Travelers Predictive Modeling Cooking Show. I'll introduce you to some of my Travelers colleagues as our show moves along today. I'm sure you've attended a lot of workshops, but today's is going to be different. You see, today you are part of a cooking show. And this isn't an ordinary cooking show. This has been presented live 18 times to over 6,000 audience members in 11 different cities, both in person and virtually, at conferences for actuaries, underwriters, regulators, and college students. But what makes this cooking show so unique? Well, it's too much to say now, but let's just say, 1, it's a competition. 2, we do involve the audience. And 3, we're not cooking food, we're cooking up predictive models. This is your chance to see it all in action, to peer into the kitchen of a modeler, to see how models are built. If you've ever watched a cooking show, you see the chef prepare a delicious spread of food in under an hour. She puts the turkey in the oven, and then a moment later, ding, like magic, pulls it out, fully roasted and ready to eat. If you can watch a chef prepare a meal in under an hour, why can't we watch someone build a predictive model? And that's exactly what we're doing today. You'll see data preparation and variable selection, the ingredients of the model. Just like the chef chooses her ingredients and starts chopping up the onions, you'll see the modeling itself, just like the chef stirs ingredients into the pot and creates a sauce. And finally, you'll see how modelers evaluate their model. This is just like a taste test. When the chef takes a bite and says, needs more pepper. Now, this is not a training event. It's a competition. The goal is for you to gain a greater appreciation of predictive modeling. I am going to invite 2 teams of actuaries from Travelers to come on stage today to try their hand at a real world problem and build a predictive model right before your eyes. Let's see them put their modeling skills to the test. And we will take questions from you at the end. But the first question in your mind is, what should we ask them to model? Let me tell you a story about what our teams will be modeling today. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic set sail with over 2,000 passengers on its maiden voyage from the UK to New York. As we all know, many lives were tragically lost when it collided with an iceberg in the Atlantic. Did you know that there are public records with demographic data on most of the Titanic's passengers, including who lived and who died? What if we give the data on some of those passengers to each modeling team today and ask them to build a model to predict whether a passenger lived based on the features in the data? I'll hold back data on some of the passengers, meaning I won't share that data with our teams. Then, once they've built their models, I'll use my computer to run their models against my holdout data set, and we'll see how well each model predicts the fate of those passengers that they didn't have in their data set when they were building their models. The team with the most accurate predictions on that holdout data set, the highest accuracy percentage, will win today's competition. So, can our teams predict who would survive the sinking of the Titanic? The event itself was tragic, and we recognize that. It took place a long time ago, and the world was a different place. But maybe we can learn something. Our goal today is to highlight key modeling concepts and have some fun along the way. And by choosing this problem, it allows you to participate too. Now, let's test out our polling software. You can scan the QR code that you're seeing or go to the website you see on the screen. It's ahaslides.com with the access code NAWA. That's AHA slides.com and then NAWA. Once you get there, please answer this question. Have you seen James Cameron's classic 1997 movie, Titanic? After you make your selection, be sure to click the submit button. As everyone votes, you should be seeing the results update live on your phone screen. You may need to refresh the browser if you aren't seeing those results. Again, that's ahaslides.com, and the code is NAWA. This website and the display QR code can be used to go straight to the polls we'll use throughout the show. So I'll give you a moment to complete this poll and click submit. All right. Looks like many of you have seen this, and a lot of you have seen it numerous times. Awesome. Now, let's talk about another way that you can participate in today's show. If you registered to attend this meeting in advance, you should have received an email from NAWA earlier today. That email includes a link to a PDF where you can find your own passenger identification card based on your birthday. That passenger ticket info is unique to you, and the information represents your passenger from the Titanic, someone who actually took the voyage that day. Please take a moment now to find the specific passenger ID card associated with it. Reference that throughout today's show. If you didn't receive an email, or if you're watching this on replay, that's okay. You can use the information for Richard Beckwith shown on the screen now. You might want to take a picture of it. Each ticket contains all the same information about each passenger that I'll give to our modelers today. These are the ingredients to the models that you'll see later. Some of you will notice that some information about your passenger is blank or missing. That's okay. It reflects the reality of our Titanic data set and of many real-life data sets. We don't always have complete information about every record in our data. Okay, so let's dial it up a notch with one more poll before I bring up our first modeling team. Let me ask you about your passenger, the one that you received from NAWA based on your birthday. Note that for this poll, we will not show the results live on your screen. And if you don't see this poll appear, please refresh your browser. Do you think your passenger lived or died? Find the color of your card. The first letter of the color is on the corners of the card. So for example, if your card is blue, there is a little B for blue in the corner. That color represents your team for today's modeling competition. There are orange, red, blue, green, pink, and yellow teams. Which team will have the most accurate predictions for its passengers? Now, go to the poll, find your team color among the poll options, and select for that color whether you think your passenger lives or dies. You might have to scroll down on your device in order to find the answer option that matches the color of your card. If you didn't receive a passenger ticket in advance, then you can answer the questions for Richard Beckwith at the very bottom of the poll. And if you're watching this on replay, the poll won't be active, but you can still think about Richard Beckwith and whether or not he survived. Go ahead and vote now. My colleague Rick is watching to see if results are coming in. And remember to click submit at the bottom of the poll so that your answer counts. All right, Rick says the votes are in and you've submitted your predictions. Later in the show, I will ask you to predict the fate of your passenger one more time, and we'll reveal the polling results as well as the fates of each individual passenger. So don't go anywhere. Your teammates are depending on you. Okay, so we are ready to start our competition. Let's meet our first modeling team. Joycelyn Arite and Rick Sutherland, come on up and join me here on the screen. All right, let's get to know these two. Joycelyn, can you introduce yourself?
Sure, Rochelle. Hello, everyone. I'm Joycelyn Aite. I support our small commercial analytics team in business insurance, and I've been working at Travelers for almost a decade now.
And I'm Rick Sutherland. I'm an actuary in our business insurance team. I support the rating plans for general liability, umbrella, and cyber insurance. And I've been working at Travelers for over 17 years now.
All right, well, it is great to have you both here today. But we've got some work to do, a competition to win. How are you two going to get started?
Well, Rick and I talked about this beforehand and decided we are going into today's competition with a basic approach. We are going to rely on our knowledge we already have about the Titanic to create a model that's easy to understand. Rick, I think we should fully embrace the philosophy of keeping it simple and name our team Occam's Razor.
Occam's Razor, Joycelyn, what is that?
Yeah, so William of Ockham is one of my favorite medieval philosophers. While he probably didn't have an actual razor, he promoted a principle now called Occam's Razor. And you might have also heard it called the principle of parsimony. So what this principle states is that one should not make more assumptions than the minimum needed.
Go back to that principle of parsimony.
Yeah, so basically Occam's Razor boils down to this. Just keep it simple.
I got that, Joycelyn, okay.
All right, Rick, so let's put our data skills to test. I don't want to do too much feature engineering with our model, but I still need to make a pretty accurate prediction. So let's keep it simple and intuitive.
All right, I agree. There's value in building a model that's easy to understand. And I have seen the Titanic movie a time or two, like much of our audience. So I'm excited to dig into this data. But there is one more thing we have to do before we can get started.
Ooh, hats. Good idea, you two.
Yeah, not getting any hair in our models.
Ugh. Thanks, Rick.
Too much? Okay, sorry. All right, let's go on with the data. When I walked into the kitchen today, there was an Excel workbook with data on about 900 of the passengers on the Titanic. It's a lot of data, over a dozen variables, numeric, descriptive, classifications. There's just a lot going on here.
Awesome, we've got all the data. Let's go, let's get modeling.
Rochelle,
Calm down.
it's not that easy, it's not so fast. This is not a frozen microwavable meal. There's a lot of preparation that goes into creating a model. We have to do planning, go through the ingredient list, understand the data we have and some of the relationships to survival. Are you shaking your head at me?
I
mean, there's stuff we have to do before we can model it.
Okay, how can this be so hard?
You never modeled before? Let me show you the data of someone who took the voyage on the Titanic so you can see how much information we really have for each person. Okay, so here's a card for Mr. Jack Dawson.
That name sounds familiar.
I thought it might. As you can see on his ticket, we know his age, where he got on the ship, even how much he paid for his ticket. But for our simple model, we don't need to use all of this information to accurately predict the survival of passengers like Jack. Although, as we can see here, he did not survive.
Well, at least his heart will go on.
Great, we've got another joker. Thanks, Lane. Ugh. Now, before we go on, let me ask you two a serious question. So the information on this ticket is filled with personal information. It has gender and age right on it. And, we might also be able to make a pretty good guess as to Jack's marital status and nationality. Can we use that in our modeling?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It really depends on the use of the model. So for example, we wouldn't want to use those traits in predictive policing, as they could be biased and tend to falsely predict criminal activity for people of color. And this is a direct way that we face in this racially imbalanced world we live in. And we have to be extremely careful about how models can adversely impact specific groups of.
Are there instances where we would want to use these characteristics?
Sure, Rochelle. Using traits like race, age, gender are critical to studying infection rates in viruses like COVID-19. That can help us develop targeted disease prevention strategies.
Okay, that makes sense. So do you both think it's okay to use these data fields with personal information to cook up your Titanic models today?
Yeah, I think we can use them. Our model is looking at a historical event with a lens on winning a cooking show, and our answers today won't impact people's lives.
All right, well, great discussion, you two. I also want to remind our audience members that while we know Jack Dawson did not survive, we did not give you survival information about your passenger. At the end of today's show, we'll tell you if your passenger survived. So keep thinking about the characteristics of your passenger and how that might have impacted their fate. Okay, Rick, Joycelyn, what's next?
Joycelyn, I'm thinking based on what I know about the Titanic, why don't we start by looking at gender?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right, so I'm going to start here by whipping up a couple of visuals that show the relationship between gender and survival. I'm trying to get a good feel for the data. What are the relationships that we should consider in our model? So in this chart, the red bars are the number of passengers that did not survive, and gold represents the passengers that did survive. And looking at the data, we can see that the women had a 75% chance of survival, way higher than the boat average of 38%.
Are you saying only 38% of the passengers on the boat survived?
That's right, Rochelle. And the men only had a 19% chance of survival.
Rick, just focus on the data, okay? Please. It's not looking too great for the men, Rick.
It's not.
Wow. So I could guess you could say chivalry isn't dead.
Well, or is it?
So what do you think we should look into next, Rick?
How about we look at passenger class next? In the movie, class impacted priority for boarding the lifeboat. So I'm curious if that's supported by the data. All right, let's take a look. Yep, obvious relationship here. The class gets better, so does the chance of survival. We should absolutely include this in our model. It also shows how much socioeconomic status impacted survivability. Think about poor Jack Dawson, male, third class. He really didn't have much of a chance. All right, next attribute, let's look at age.
Okay. Rick, how did you choose these age groupings?
Yeah, I find it easier to look at data if it's logically grouped up. So I separated it into a small group for young children, and then I just went up by decades. I wanted to make sure there was enough data in each grouping.
I think that's a good idea with the groupings. And I noticed right off the bat that children survived at a higher rate, but the survival rate is fairly similar in middle age groups. All the groups from age 15 to 64 survived at about a 40% rate. Maybe we should put them all in one group for adults.
I agree with that, Joycelyn, but then look at that 65 plus group. They only had a 9% survival rate. Maybe we need a separate category for seniors?
Yeah, we could, but it's such a small sample size. Let's group them with the adults.
Good point.
Okay, so we've got children, we've got adults, but look at that last category called missing. 170 people where we don't know their age. What will you do with that, Joycelyn?
Yeah, there are several ways we could use to replace the missing values with the gas. I mean, we could use the average of all the passengers on the Titanic, or we could try to predict age from other variables. But to keep things simple, let's just leave it as its own separate category missing.
Okay. What's next, the model?
We are getting closer, Rochelle, I promise. But we need to look at least one more variable here, because at our last show, I was talking to one of the audience members before we started. She noticed that the passenger on her ID card only paid $2 for a Titanic ticket. It made me wonder if she was onto something. When we build models at Travelers, some of our best features often start with the knowledge and curiosity of our business partners. Underwriters, claim professionals, great sources of information to find out what features we should even be considering. So I do think it's important we look at the data we have about the fare price that each passenger paid.
Whoa, look at all these different fare amounts.
Yeah, so if we look through the whole data set, we can see that some people paid less than $10 and others paid over $50 for the same voyage. Let's group it up like we did with age. All right, so this is a little more complicated graph, but there is a relationship. So the left axis is related to the bars, and it shows the number of passengers who survived and perished. And on the right axis, the percentages related to the line, they show the percentage of passengers who survived in each fare grouping. At the bottom on the x-axis, you can see how I grouped up the ticket prices. The higher the ticket price, the greater the chance of survival.
Wait, this is just like passenger class. We're seeing the same socioeconomic factors in the data. The more well off you were, the more likely you were to survive.
Mm-hmm.
So now thinking about this from a modeling perspective, I worry there could be a strong relationship between fare type and class, and it opens up the possibility of an unstable or overfit model.
Huh, overfit? What does that mean?
Yeah, so an overfit model is simply one that fits the data so well that it does not generalize the new data.
That's true, Joycelyn, I agree with you. But for now, why don't we include fare, because it does have an apparent relationship with survival, and then we can just let our model determine how fare fares. Not going to stop, Rochelle. I'm not going to stop. Okay. I will keep going though. I think we've got our ingredients. We've identified the right features to build the model, and they all have a strong relationship to survival.
Okay, Joycelyn, how are you going to turn these ingredients into a meal?
Well, welcome to my corner of the kitchen. I am going to open my favorite modeling software, RStudio. But I need to make a few choices. First, what kind of model am I going to build? Second, what data should I use to build the model? And then finally, how am I going to measure the performance of the model? So for this kind of problem, we are predicting the probability of whether someone lives or survives, which is a binary classification problem. There are many different modeling approaches, but I'm going to go into my GLM cabinet and pull out my trusty logistic regression model.
Okay, GLM, logistic, translate.
Well, GLMs are simply generalized linear models. They are much like linear regression, where you model the linear relationship of one or more variable with your target variable. And GLMs are some incredibly nice additional flexibility, and logistic regression is just one type of GLM that is perfect for predicting probability. For today's modeling problem, I'm going to say that if the predicted probability of survival is above 50, then we are saying the passenger lived.
Okay, it's settled. You'll use a logistic regression model. Now, what are you going to do with all that data?
Great question. So here's the data I was provided in green with 891 records where we know who survived. The holdout data is the one in blue that will determine the winner. We don't know who died in the data set, but we'll add our predictions.
Okay, I do get that the green and the blue are the data sets. But like all that gibberish at the top, what is that?
Oh, those are just the instructions that I type into RStudio to tell it what to do. So here I'm asking it to import my training and holdout data. As we go through each step in the modeling process, I'll continue to show you the R code that I use to generate the results. So next, I'm going to choose to carve up the training data into two random parts, leaving 30% of the passenger records for the validation data set.
All right, hold on. I'm going to stop you there. We only have 900 records to begin with, and now you're going to hold back 30% and not use those to build our model. Why wouldn't we use all the data that we just worked so hard to prepare?
That's a really good question, Rick. With data sets this small, it can be easy to find something that seems important in the training data, but doesn't generalize to other data sets. So I need to be very cautious about being duped into believing those features, so the validation data set will serve as a taste test to detect any overfitting.
Okay, that does make sense. So I think you had one final decision to make before you start coding, something about how to measure the performance of your model.
Right. There are many ways to measure how well the model is performing, and I'm going to use two. First, I'll measure accuracy, which is often how our model correctly predicts who lives or dies. We want accuracy to be as high as possible. And this is also really important today because Rochelle said she's going to use that to determine who today's winner is based on accuracy. But I also want a second measure called AIC.
AIC, what's that?
So AIC is simply going to tell me how well the model's prediction line up with the observation, and it adds a penalty for each additional variable. We want the AIC to be as low as possible to help us keep things simple.
Okay, got it. AIC and accuracy, and that's all the decisions you needed to make, right?
You got it. So let's build our model.
Finally.
All right, so just to show you how this works, let me start with the simplest possible model, the intercept only. So let's first look up at the top of the screen. You can see the R code that generated this model, as well as my initial model performance.
Yep, and we're starting with an AIC of 834. We want that to be as low as possible. And we have an accuracy of 62%. We're going to try to get that up as high as possible.
Wait, how can you be 62% accurate when you haven't put any ingredients on the plate yet?
Yeah, this model is pretty morbid. It predicts that everybody dies. And since 62% of the passengers actually died, we get credit for all of them. But I think we can do way better than this.
Okay, I get that. If you predict everyone dies, you'll be 62% accurate. But now I do see a lot of numbers and colors on the screen. What's going on down there?
Yeah, so the section below keeps track of how our model is performing on the ingredient that Rick identified. So the colorful column is the remaining errors, and that is how I know there's a lot of opportunity to create a better model. So let's add our first key ingredient, gender.
All right, let's see. First, take a look at AIC and accuracy. The AIC decreased, that's a good thing, and accuracy increased. That's what we'd expect.
Joycelyn, where did all these factors and percents come from? Did you have to calculate each one yourself?
God, no. The R software has a built-in algorithm that helps solve for these factors, and I compile the results based on the instructions I give it.
Okay, so the algorithm generated that 0.1 factor for the male gender, but so what? What does a factor of 0.1 tell us?
Good question. So in this case, a factor of 0.1 says that men in comparison to women had significantly lower odds of survival. So also notice the big red bar in the impact to survival column. That's just a visual for how large the impact of gender is to survival. So stay tuned for the next variable and we can compare the relative impacts of the bars.
Okay. I'm also seeing that the errors changed. What's going on there?
Yeah, so a couple of things to note in the error column. When we added the gender variable, the error for gender went to 0. This is what we expect to happen with logistic regression. It will fit the data you provided the model perfectly. The second thing to notice is the error for the other variables also changed.
Wait, how can that be? You haven't added those variables yet.
I know that one. All of the other variables are at least somewhat correlated with gender. So gender picked up on some of the other variables' effects.
Okay. Gotcha.
All right, let's see what happens then when we add our next variable, passenger class.
Oh, wow, look at how the errors in the fare changed there down on the bottom.
Yeah, that's right, Rick. So when I added in passenger class, the error rates and fares dropped considerably. And it looks like those traveling with the first class tickets had the best chance of survival. And that lines up with what we expected. Now also notice the green bar showed up indicating a positive impact to survival for passenger class 1.
Rick, do you notice anything else?
You know, I'm going up to the numbers. I was looking at the numbers. AIC down from 646 to 590, and accuracy stayed the same. So that's still an overall better model. At least the AIC improved.
Wait, how is it possible that the AIC improved, but the accuracy didn't budge?
You know, I was wondering about that as well. I believe it's likely due to the fact that none of our predicted probabilities shifted across the 50% threshold. So let's just see what happens when we add age.
Okay, so we added age to the model, and now we get improvement in both AIC and accuracy.
Okay, so it looks like children are seeing the largest impact on survival. So no surprises there. I want to try one more variable. Let's add fare.
See how it fares. Okay, accuracy improving, but the AIC went up. Uh-oh.
Yeah, that's the wrong direction. I want to lower AIC, but that doesn't really surprise me. Our model is being penalized for complexity. Now is when we pause and look at the validation data sets. All right, so up to this point, we've been focusing on the training data set. So when I look at the validation accuracy for the 4-variable model, we get more of the story. It appears on validation data that both AIC and accuracy deteriorate when we move from the 3 to 4-variable model, suggesting we are actually overfitting it to the training data set. So I think I'm going to drop fare and revert to the 3-variable model.
It sounds like you tasted something you didn't like when you added fare, so you decided against including fare in your final recipe.
That's right, Rochelle. Every good chef pauses to do a taste test every once in a while, and then you adjust accordingly.
And hey, it looks like your model has a 79% accuracy on the validation data set. That's pretty impressive. So I gotta ask, is this your final model?
Final model.
Great work, you two. You can have a seat. And we will return to the action in just a moment, right after this brief word from our NAWA sponsor. All right, costumes, please. All right. Let's get some background in here. All right, here we go. NAWA thanks these founding sponsors who have demonstrated their commitment to empowering women in the actuarial profession with generous donations and their continuous support of our efforts. Together, we will move the needle on the inclusion of women across the profession at every level, conference, and boardroom. Interested in becoming a NAWA sponsor? Please visit nawaactuaries.org/sponsor to learn more about how you can make a difference today. Can go now. Okay, welcome back to the cooking show. Our first team has submitted their model. And now I'm going to welcome our second team to the screen. Let's see what they can cook up. I've got Elizabeth Demon-Storm and Ellie Greiber.
Rochelle, I'm Elizabeth Storm, the lead pricing actuary for personal insurance property line, primarily supporting homeowners, and I've been at Travelers for 11 years.
And my name is Ellie Greiber. I have been at Travelers for a little over 4 years now, and I'm part of our Actuarial Leadership Development Program. And currently I work in business insurance, actuarial, and analytics.
All right, Elizabeth, Ellie, How do you want to get started?
Well, I have to say, I like the simplicity of Occam's razor's model, but I'd like to take a different approach so that we can make an even better model. Ellie, do you have any data engineering ideas to really get the most out of our ingredients?
I sure do, Elizabeth. But first, let's give our team a name. What do you think about slice and dice? Because I think if we cut a little bit deeper into some of those data fields, I'm willing to bet we'll discover some additional flavors that Occam's razor never found.
Slice and dice. Sounds perfect.
Okay, so first I'm going to load our data into Jupyter Hub so we can see that on the screen. And there you can see my R code and the first few records and features. I'm starting with the same basic attributes that Joycelyn and Rick looked at: gender, passenger class, fare, and age.
I like starting with gender and age since those things are obviously important. But do you think we can get a little fancier? Maybe age matters more for males than for females. Maybe there's some sort of interaction. Is there any way we can see how gender and age relate to each other?
Elizabeth, prepare to be amazed. I'm about to get upper deck of the Titanic level fancy. So I was thinking along those same lines too, and I want to take a deeper look into the name column of the data. I think there may be some ways to look at both gender and age in the same field.
Okay. So we see gender and name, no big deal, right? What will that tell us?
Well, what if we look at one specific element in that name field though?
Oh, okay. So you're looking at Miss, Mrs., Mr. rather than just the name itself.
Exactly. We could call that the passenger's title. So I'm just going to take that title portion from the data fields here. And to simplify our table, I'm just going to pull out gender in that title for those same 5 sample passengers. And here it looks like Mr. correlates to male while Mrs. and Miss correlate to female.
So there's definitely a correlation between title and gender. But what about age?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's actually build a table here that looks at title and age and define anyone that's under 16 as a child and everyone else as an adult. For each of the titles, we see the number of passengers in each of the age groups. I grouped all less frequently occurring titles as other title just to avoid any overfitting in the models.
Hey, Ellie, I see one title called Master. That's interesting.
Yeah, I thought so too, but actually at the time when the Titanic sailed, Master was actually a polite prefix for any young male that wasn't old enough to be called Mr. yet.
Ah, okay. I didn't realize that. So, okay, that's why the title Master occurs 36 times with only children. And similarly, I see that Mrs. occurred 105 times with adults. So, okay, that makes sense.
All right, so we got the correlation there with title and age. I think this will definitely add some flavor to our model. What other ingredients do you have?
Well, we can start by looking at any of the other available data without any preconceived ideas, just to see if there might be some additional flavors that we haven't examined yet. It's kind of like a taste test for any possible ingredients that we have in these kitchen cupboards back here. So let's take a look.
Oh, look at this one. I see a downward trend in part of this graph.
Hang on the x-axis, what is SIBSPA?
Okay, fair question. I'll put that here on the slide for you. SIBSPA is the number of siblings or spouses, and it even appeared on the ID cards that we gave our passengers or our audience members today. So on the left of this graph, you can see that there were about 600 passengers with no siblings or spouses. And the line shows that about 35% of them survived. Elizabeth, I think you're right that there does appear to be a downward trend, but that doesn't start until we have one sibling or spouse.
But what's happening at 0? Why is the survive percentage lower for the single people?
Well, this might actually highlight why models can be so powerful. They get at that multivariate effect that can exist in data. We already saw that men had a lower chance of survival. I wonder if that group without any siblings or spouses is mostly adult males. Let's look at the same graph, but exclude the male passengers.
Hey, it looks like you're right. Looking at only female passengers, we don't see that dip in survival rate at 0 siblings or spouses.
This looks really promising. But why would siblings and spouses matter?
Well, I keep thinking back to the movie and there just seemed to be so much commotion. So maybe having more passengers or loved ones on the ship affected who got onto those lifeboats. So I did glance at some other variables in the data, and SIPSA wasn't the only variable that relates to who the passenger was traveling. There's also a data field called Parch.
Parch. That sounds like how thirsty the passenger was.
Michelle, that would be a silly data field to have. Parch is actually short for parents and children, or how many parents and children the passenger was traveling with. That's also on the passenger ID cards that we handed out or emailed out to the audience today. You could combine Parch and SIPSA to calculate the total family size on the ship. So what I'm going to do with that is create some groupings to represent each type of family size. If the group size is 1, we'll call that an individual. If the group size is 2, 3, or 4, we'll call that a small family. If the group size is 5 or more, we'll call that a large family.
So like Mr. Owen Harris with a group of 2 would be a small family. What do you think that would mean for him?
Good question. Let's see how survival correlates with all of our variables, including family size. Ellie, can you whip up a correlation matrix?
Sure can. Got my trusty tool for that. And it seems to get a little slow. Maybe it's back from when the Titanic sailed, who knows? But looks like it worked well enough. And here's my correlation plot there. The darker colors and larger numbers, those closer to 1 or -1, indicate that a feature is more strongly correlated, either positively or negatively, with another feature or response variable. So as you can see along this middle diagonal, all the boxes are gray and say 1. That's because we're comparing the same feature to itself. If it has 100% correlation with itself, if we're comparing it to itself. But we grade those out to focus on different variables' correlations with each other.
So what does the dark red -0.5 mean for fare and passenger class?
Yeah, I would say that those fields have a strong negative correlation. And that's actually what Joycelyn and Rick found when they tried to include both passenger and class and the fare price into their model. Both of them together was just too much.
Can we see how the correlation to survival is for all of our newly derived features?
Absolutely. While I was whipping that up, I also whipped together 2 new matrices to look at that correlation between survival rate and our new derived features. So looking at this, there's strong correlations between survival and our derived feature fields of passenger title on the top and family size on the bottom.
So if we're thinking back to Mr. Owen Harris traveling with a small family, that 0.3 in the blue box means he's more likely to survive. And that makes sense.
Yeah, looking at those smaller families, it seemed like they had the best chance of survival. And looking at the passenger titles on the top, we can see that the title Mr. strongly reduces the chance of survival, while Master, Miss, and Mrs. all correlate with increased survival. Okay, Elizabeth, I think I've sliced and diced the data as much as I can. It's time to put your MasterChef skills to the test.
All right. Thanks, Ellie. I'm going to start with the same variables that Joycelyn looked at, passenger class, gender, and fare, but I'm also going to look at title and family size, the new variables that Ellie prepared. And I'm also going to look at port of embarkation, or where the passenger got onto the Titanic.
That sounds good. And what type of model do you think you're going to build?
Well, there's many different approaches I could take. For today, I'm going to stick this to the same approach that Joycelyn used, that I'm going to use a logistic regression, and I'm going to add 1 variable at a time. So let's jump into R and start cooking. All right, we're going to start with our title in our model. Think of this as our base. We want to have that solid variable to start with so that as we add other ingredients, we can really focus on how the flavor changes.
Makes sense. But can you explain to me what's going on in the graph?
Sure. So this graph shows the model accuracy. The red dot represents the accuracy on the training set, while the blue dot represents the accuracy on the validation set.
So a great start here. Using just the title variable, you can see that our model is already predicting correctly 78% of the time on the training data set or on the validation data set.
Yep. And remember that the model hasn't seen this validation data before, so it's keeping us honest. Let's see what it looks like when we add in the next variable, passenger class. Looks like that is predictive as well. And look, my dots have grown into lines as I've gone from 1 predictor to 2, and the lines are trending upwards, which means I've increased the accuracy of my model by adding the second variable.
Okay, Elizabeth, I've got another question. It looks like so far the accuracy on your validation data set, the blue line, is consistently lower than the accuracy of your training data set, the red line. Is that typical for validation accuracy to be worse than training accuracy?
Yes, that is very typical, because when we build the model, we're finding the model that fits as close as possible to our training data, but we're looking at the validation data when we build the model. So we're not even looking at the validation data, so we expect the model accuracy to be a little bit lower on that validation data.
Yeah, and Rochelle, the same thing should happen when you judge today's competition and determine the winner by looking at the accuracy of the models on the holdout data set. Neither of our teams were able to look at that holdout data set, so our models haven't seen it before. So we'll likely see that will be lower than the training data.
Okay, thank you.
All right, on to the next variable, family size. Ooh, there's definitely an increase in accuracy when we add family size.
Slice and dice, this is awesome. Your model just keeps getting more and more accurate. What happens if we keep going?
Well, usually as we add more and more variables, the training accuracy will increase and increase, but then start leveling off eventually.
Okay, that didn't happen here. It actually seems like we saw a decrease in training accuracy. What happened? Did you add like 3 ingredients at once?
Yeah, but I threw in gender, fair, and port of embarkation, and none of them really seemed to help us out. And that's probably because this is a really small data set with variables that are highly correlated, which is giving us some unstable coefficients. So this isn't common, but it can happen from time to time.
Okay, so typically training levels off, but didn't you say that it's validation accuracy that really matters?
Exactly right. If the validation accuracy increases, but then starts decreasing, that's a sign that we're overfitting the training data and we should stop adding variables.
Yeah, it's just like cooking and adding more ingredients. It doesn't always make something taste better.
Yep. So let's stick with a 3-variable model. Let's go with the title, the passenger class, and the family size as our final model. And with our deeper look at the variables, I think our model is truly unsinkable.
Oh, okay, not again. So slice and dice. Your model is complete and supposedly unsinkable.
It is.
How do you think it will compare with the Occam's razor model?
Well, we have a few different statistical measures that we can use to answer that question. And the first one we're going to jump into is one you may have seen before, a lift chart.
No. Can I just retract the question? I just hate lift charts. They're so confusing.
Oh, don't worry. We'll take you through the process of how we put a lift chart together.
All right, so I'll start us off here. First, we're going to compare the models and look at how each of them performs on the validation data set. Remember, that's the data that we didn't use when we were building our models, but we still know whether each passenger lived or died. So it's great for getting a preliminary look at how each model will perform on data it hasn't seen before.
The ultimate test will come later when Rochelle runs each model using the holdout data set, but for now, the validation data is our best test for each model.
So we'll start with looking at Occam's razor model and build a lift chart using the performance on the validation data set. So we can take a look at all of the passengers in the validation set and sort them based on Occam's razor's prediction of their probability of survival. At the top of the list are those that the model predicted were least likely to survive. And at the bottom, we see that those that the model deemed most likely to survive. And in between, we have the rest of the passengers sorted.
And then the next thing we're going to do is take that sorted list and then break it into even groups. We could choose any number of groups to build a lift chart, but for this example, we're going to go with 5 even groups. And then within each of those groups, they would represent a group of passengers who had very similar probability of surviving. The next, within each group, we calculate the actual survival rate So here you can see for Occam's razor's model, it's doing pretty well. In group 1, the passengers they predicted were least likely to survive, only 13% actually survived. Whereas in group 5, the passengers they predicted were most likely to survive, 94% of those passengers actually survived.
Okay, so now this is the same table that of actual survival rates that we were just looking at, but now it's laid out in a graph. The advantage of this graphical form is that you can really see that steep increase from left to right.
So steep is good. We want steep.
Yes, if there's one thing you take away from this about lift charts, it should be that steep line for actuals means a strong model performance, as the model is really differentiating between low and high. So the steeper, the better.
Except when it's the deck of the Titanic.
So
So that was a good one.
well, let's keep in mind for lift charts, only lift charts, the steeper the better. As we add our model to the graph, you can see Occam's razor model in the blue line, and then Slice and Dice's model is the steeper red line. Let's focus on a couple of points to make sure we're really understanding what's going on here. To the far left, we have group 1, the passengers that each model predicted were the least likely to survive. And then for Occam's razor group, 13% actually survived. And for Slice and Dice's group, only 4% actually survived.
Good sign, good sign. Looks like our model does a better job of sorting out those that were least likely to survive.
So like Occam's razor's model was a bit too optimistic.
Exactly. At least for group 1. And so then we'll look at the other side, group 5. For those, each model predicted who was most likely to survive. And we can see Slice and Dice's model still edges out Occam's razor's a little bit at 98% to 94%.
Great, so by this graphical comparison, it does appear that our model sorts out the passengers better than Occam's razor's model. But there are multiple ways to compare model performance and multiple ways to view it. Another helpful view is a confusion matrix.
A confusion matrix is just a table that we use to compare the predicted to what actually happened.
Okay, I will try to follow you on this one.
All right, let's look at the label on the left. Table is breaking out the model prediction into yes and no. And we're using the same assumption that Joycelyn and Rick used. We're saying that the predicted probability of survival is greater than 50%, then we're predicting that the passenger lived, or yes. And then along the top, we have the actual survival, yes or no, what actually happened to that passenger.
Right, so looking at this upper left of each table, the model prediction equals no and survived equals no. This is one of the spots where the model and reality agreed. The model said that the passenger did not survive and the actual passenger did not in fact survive. And in the lower right, you can see the same thing. The model and reality agreed again. This is the time where the passenger survived.
Okay, so the yellow highlighted areas indicate where the model predicted accurately.
Yes, so we want larger numbers in the highlighted yellow areas to indicate better model performance. On the opposite diagonals, we can see the opposite cases where the model and reality disagreed. Here, lower numbers indicate a better model performance. And so have you ever heard of the terms false positive and false negative?
Yeah, absolutely, in the context of COVID testing.
Exactly.
So are we more concerned with false positives or false negatives?
It really depends on the model and the context. For highly contagious diseases, we may want the model to minimize the false negatives. It's really bad to be infected and assume you're not, and then you spread the disease further. But on the other hand, there's situations where we would really be concerned about false positives. For example, in insurance modeling, we sometimes create models to identify fraudulent claims. And if the fraud model predicts a claim is likely to be fraud, but it's actually not, we could potentially harm our relationship with the insured if we falsely accuse them of fraud.
Yeah, and this is a good time to highlight the differences between competition modeling and more practical modeling. Often when we model in competition, our goal is to achieve the best score. In our case today, accuracy. Conversely, in the real world, the desire is to achieve the best outcome for the given problems, like the examples you mentioned.
Yes, and the only thing I'm considering today is accuracy. And by that measure, it looks like the slice and dice model outperforms Occam's razors model by just a little bit, 82% to 79%.
Well, that's a fantastic sign, and I'm really excited about that. We have to be fair, and there's also qualitative criterion that's worth mentioning when we're comparing models. Like, how easy is it to explain and interpret the model?
Good point, Ellie. The two models have different sets of predictors. Occam's razors model probably does a little bit better in this criteria, as telling the story behind their predictors is easier. Gender, passenger class, age, those are all pretty straightforward predictors. In Slice and Dice's model, title and family size did require a little bit more of a story to get across as to how they're derived and why they're important. So if explainability is important on how they're doing, how we're going to use this model, then their model maybe has a little bit of an edge on ours.
Yeah, and with insurance models, because many of our pricing plans are subject to state regulation, we often have to think about each variable's explainability, not just to our business partners, but also to regulators who will evaluate and approve our models. So using complex variables can lead to better model performance, but sometimes that comes at the cost of making it harder to explain to regulators.
Those are great points. Thank you for touching on that. Well, we've gotten to the point in the show you have all been waiting for. Let's perform the final test to see who wins today's competition. I'm going to run the two models on that holdout set, which are the passengers neither team has seen before, and determine which model more accurately predicts the fate of passengers. My computer is working to evaluate the results, and I'll share those as soon as they're ready. Meanwhile, it's your turn, NAWA. In just a second, I will ask you again to predict the fate of your passenger. To recap the models, Occam's razor says, simple, male passengers and third-class passengers are not as likely to survive. Slice and Dice added subtle hints of predictive value by showing the title Master Fared Well and combined it with a bolder flavor, that of larger group sizes not faring so well. Did your passenger live or die? Our final poll asks you again to predict the fate of your passenger. Find the color of your team and answer whether you think your passenger lived or died. It's okay if you vote differently based on what you learned during the show. Same polling software as before. Go to ahaslides.com with the code NAWA and submit your prediction now. You might need to scroll down on your device to find your team's color in the poll options. Again, we're not showing the polling results live on your screen, and we'll reveal the accuracy of your predictions in just a minute. If you didn't receive NAWA's email with your passenger assignment in advance of the session, or if you're watching the show on replay, then you can use Richard Beckwith on the screen now. So take a moment to consider your final prediction. Did your passengers survive? And remember to scroll down and click submit to send us your prediction. While you're voting, let me tell you how our other cooking show audiences have done with their predictions. Remember, we've done the show 18 times to over 6,000 audience members, so we've got a lot of data on the total accuracy of our audience members' predictions. In the middle of the screen, I'm displaying the collective results from that first poll, the one we take at the beginning of the show before the audience has seen our chefs build their models. At that time, across all our shows, the audience accuracy was 58%. Now, let's compare that to how our past audiences did after watching our teams compete in the second poll near the end of the show. Ideally, if people are learning something from watching, we'd see their predictions get better. So how'd they do? Their accuracy increased to 74.5% after watching the modelers. That's pretty good. It looks like we are teaching people something about predicting. But Those are the numbers from our past audiences. How do you think you did, our live NAWA annual meeting audience? Well, the poll results are in and we are ready to reveal your team's accuracy. The color of your team actually determined your passenger's fate. If you are on the pink or red team, your passenger survived. If your team is any other color, your passenger died. And if you were predicting the fate of Mr. Beckwith, I've got good news about him. He also survived. Were you right? If you guessed correctly, congrats. If you didn't guess correctly, you learned firsthand a principle of modeling. Not every prediction is 100% guaranteed to be accurate. Okay, so I believe Rick has been busy compiling the results of each of the audience teams, and he should be ready to tell you how your team did in today's competition. Rick, what can you tell us?
Yeah, we do have results in from the polling that occurred today, and you just brought it up on the screen right now, so you can see how the team did in total, as well as how each individual team did. Let's start with the total at the bottom. So as we often do, we see some improvement here on the first poll. As a total group, this audience today was 63% accurate. After they watched us build the models and learned about the characteristics, accuracy went up to 67% today. It's very interesting divisions by team here. The blue team at the top, man, you guys were good. Like accurate at the beginning, 89% of you were accurate in the first poll and then 90% on the second poll. So that was good, but the green team kicked it into gear in that second poll and passed them a little bit. So the green team got up to 92% accuracy on the second poll, just barely beating the blue team and finishing in first place in our competition. So congratulations to the green team, great job. I also want to talk about Mr. Beckwith, so that you can see the Beckwith group had some challenges, right? 60% on the first poll and then down to 17% in the second poll. Beckwith that's a tricky one, right? He's an adult male, which decreases his survival probability, but he also traveled in first class with a small family, which increased his chances. Good news, at the end of the day, he was one of the fortunate ones, but I can see why the Beckwith team had some trouble. That outcome was not obvious from the data. So, all right, now Rochelle, we know how our audience did today, 67% accurate, not bad. It'll be interesting to compare that to the final accuracy of the two predictive models that our teams built. Do you have results yet on Occam's razor versus slice and dice?
Well, in fact, yes, I do, Rick.
Right.
My computer has just finished. Let's see how accurate the models were on passenger data they hadn't seen before. Now, we saw earlier that Occam's razor was 79% accurate on both its training and validation data sets. How did that model do on the true test, the holdout set? Occam's razor predicted correctly on 77% of the passengers.
Not bad, Rick. I think we have a chance.
I agree, yeah.
Maybe. Let's see how Slice and Dice did. Can they top Occam's razor when we apply their model to that holdout set? Yes, Slice and Dice guessed correctly on 78.5% of the passengers. Based on accuracy alone, Slice and Dice wins.
Thanks, Rochelle.
Congratulations.
Important to keep in mind, while Slice and Dice had better accuracy, sometimes you might choose a model that is simpler or easier to explain, and maybe Occam's razor would be better in that regard. Nice job, teams. Now let's open to Q&A with our audience. Now is the time to submit your questions in the Zoom chat. If you'd prefer to come off mute and ask your question directly, you can raise your virtual hand in the Zoom reactions, or just speak up and tell us you have a question. While you're thinking of your question, I'll get us started by asking a question to Ellie. Ellie, tell us more about the 77% versus 78.5% accuracy. Is that a significant difference? What would you expect when you are measuring model accuracy?
Yeah, that's a really fair question, and it really just depends, Rochelle. Different modeling problems would have different accuracy thresholds. So if you're trying to tell people whether or not they should go on the Titanic ship, the answer doesn't really matter very much on the model's accuracy when it's a point or two apart. The answer would be the same, just don't get on the boat. But when you're selling life insurance, I bet the difference in accuracy of 77% versus 78.5% could have a significant impact on your pricing or your competitive position in the marketplace. And then speaking of which, when we were doing our research for the show, we actually found out that Travelers was in the business of selling life insurance when the Titanic set sail in the early 1900s. And Travelers ended up paying out over $1 million to surviving family members who were our customers that lost their lives that day. And that's over $30 million in equivalent dollars in today's dollars.
Wow, thank you, Ellie.
Mhm.
Now let's take questions from our audience members. Again, you can type your question in the chat, just come off of mute and speak up. What questions do you have? All right, so one question we have, can you talk about how class imbalance and the target variable can affect which metrics you might use to test how well a model is performing? Want to take that?
I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
Yeah, so there is like, you do want to test to make sure that if you're trying to test between two buckets, like survival, yes or no, that you have kind of equal number, like not a complete imbalance of almost no numbers in one bucket and a lot and everything else in the other bucket. So we don't do a lot of logistic regression modeling within our space here at Travelers, so it's not necessarily something we run into on a regular basis. So I would recommend that if you are doing more of this type of modeling, you would need to do some research into making sure that you don't have a class imbalance, and doing some correction if you do have that possible. But off the top of our heads, wouldn't necessarily have a recommendation.
I could clarify if you're having trouble understanding. Sorry, maybe I didn't word that very well. I'm Lizzie. I do predictive modeling at Everest Reinsurance. Basically, I just kind of wanted to talk about, because I just think it's a good point of like when you have a big class imbalance, like for example, if you're working with like claims where like not most policies don't have a claim, or like submissions, if you have like a high rate of acceptance or a low rate of acceptance, like using a metric like accuracy where you did in this, and you showed it really well, right? That like if 60% survive, you could just guess everybody survives, and then you get a 60% accuracy rate. So when you have a class imbalance, you can do things like weighting your smaller class more heavily in your metric, or using something different like an F2 score or an AUCPR. I was just curious if you guys have different strategies when you have that class imbalance versus when you don't.
Yeah, I think it would be so case by case that we don't necessarily have like a recommendation off the top of our heads right now. That's a good point to bring up.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And it does, I mean, each situation is different, and what you really bring up is you need to know your data and look at those kind of splits and see if there is an imbalance in the split and in the data as you're deciding what metrics you're going to use to test the quality of your model. That's a good point.
Another question that came through is, was there a difference in the passenger attributes by team? For example, were blue passengers mostly adult males?
Yeah, I can take that. It was random, and we didn't look at the attributes by team ourselves. I mean, you guys have the PDF with the data in it, so you could look through and see. It was literally just a random placement and obviously we used pink and red for the survivors and the 4 other colors for the parish, but then within that, we just put them up randomly. The teams were really small, right? I think the largest team had about 20 people on it. One team had about 10 people on it. So there's going to be those kind of mixed differences. So yeah, I mean, it's not really a fair competition, and there certainly would have been different mixes of passengers, some of which would have been harder to predict than others, depending on your team. So yeah, it's totally random.
All right. Any other questions? Another couple of seconds here.
Yeah, feel free to speak up if you have a question or throw one more in the chat.
All right. Well, thank you. As the credits roll, I want to thank all of the people who helped bring this cooking show to you. All the people shown on the screen worked tirelessly to make our show a reality. We also want to thank NAWA for inviting us to present today, and thanks especially to all of you, our audience members, for participating in our session. We would appreciate your feedback and additional questions. Feel free to connect with us using the email address shown at the top right of your screen now, cookingshow@travelers.com. In conclusion, we hope you enjoyed today's show, and we hope you gained a greater appreciation of predictive modeling. Next time you sit down to consume a meal, we hope you appreciate the ingredients and the preparation that went into it. And be sure to send your compliments to the chef.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank